Hi, Indy. Thank
Hi,
you
Hannah.
for so generous with your time. I said this earlier, and I don't think that a lot of the attendees are here, but I'm ecstatic. I'm so excited to have you joining us and to talk a little bit about research. I'm a researcher myself. One thing I think that's worth mentioning is the Ladies at UX community is made up of UX practitioners at many different stages of their career with a wide range of expertise and specializations. And as may have mentioned, you really helped shape the UX industry overall, which is massive and one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you. So just to kick us off, I was wondering if perhaps you could walk us through your beginnings in the field and just what it kind of looked like at the time.
Yeah. Well, that's a big thing to say I have helped shape. And I'm so excited that I can help everybody, right? And that everybody can take it from here because this is a really collaborative kind of a group. And we're just growing and not just growing in size or expertise, but learning what we can do to help support people better. And that's what I think drives a lot of us and why a lot of us are here. The beginning of my career was very different because it was a time, it was in the 80s. it Interaction design was sort of just starting. There was no such thing as user experience. There was no such thing as research, even. There was no usability testing. And so this is, we were all inventing it as we went. I think in the beginning, I was really interested in the front end. I started getting my master's degree in computer science, but they wanted me to learn how to write operating systems and compilers. And I'm like, I don't want to write operating systems and compilers. But at the same time, I had some summer jobs with a group of people who did just that. They wrote compilers for supercomputer systems. So supercomputers, they were hardware geeks and they wouldn't write any software for them. And so there was this group who would write software for the supercomputers. And that was this group. So I was super lucky to sort of get in with this group to learn about that. And I said, hey, let me do the front end for the compiler. Let me do the edit, debug, and compile sort of interface. And of course, at that time, what we were doing was designing front ends for other engineers and scientists. Me in particular, I was doing it for other developers. And so I knew what we wanted, right? There was a way of doing it. There was a standard operating procedure that you could say an SOP, standard operating procedure, for a lot of science and engineering. And we would just embody that. We would make the algorithm be that and make the front end sort of represent that algorithm. And so it was it was not focused on people. It was focused on the procedure, the method, right? About 5 or 6 years later, and I was working with Visa International, and they had this group. So Visa is the credit card company. And they had this group at a bank in Baltimore who were taking calls internationally from people who had lost their card or had their card stolen. And this was just after the era of traveler's checks. If you even know what those are. So international travel was just getting going. You had to pay for things internationally, but how do you do it without getting money locally? And how do you even do that? There weren't really ATMs. Those were just coming out. In fact, I remember one of my coworkers at Visa, who has lived in Seattle for probably 2.5 decades now. She's the one who taught me how to get money using your Visa card through an ATM. So very different world. But what was happening there was they were going from sort of this thing they call green screen all these reps, you walk into the room and all these reps, I think there were like 14 languages on the floor at a time. So you would walk in and it's like the Tower of Babel. It was really wild, very energizing. And everybody had their little carol, and their headsets, right? But the headsets would detach and they would get up and run around the room a lot. And they'd go tap on each other's shoulders. Hey, I'm trying to deliver a card to that little town. I remember you did that too, because you said something about it in the break room. Where did you deliver that card, right? And then they had atlases at the ends of the aisles, and they would run the atlases, and they're trying to look things up and try to find, a bank or somewhere safe to deliver the card, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it was a very collaborative type of a thing. And I looked at the green screen. The green screen just means it wasn't Windows and mouse based. You use your keyboard, you use your tab key to get between fields, fill out fields, try to get things. You had to know what the process was and fill out fields to get the process to happen. I knew that we couldn't just turn that into Windows and mouse based. I knew that we needed to embody the way that people interacted with one another as well. What I heard over and over again is like, it was really speedy to use the tab key to get between these form fields. And gosh, I'm a little afraid of having a new system where it would slow that down or interfere with me being able to do some of the things that I do now. So if anybody's computer science, I came back and I made a state machine that represented the interactions that the representatives were having with the system and with each other and with their customer. A state machine was the only tool I had to represent that network of things. And what ended up falling out of that was the very early version of a mental model diagram. And what happened then was the team that was doing the data schema and the databases, I sort of like, out of that fell an initial version of the data schema, and they're all like, oh, hey, this rocks. I'm going to use that. And then the software architect is like, well, the way that this is laid out, we need to do this, this, and this to make the system hold together. And the business development folks, everybody kind of came together around this little model, which was super powerful. And that is kind of, it was something that I needed to improve over time, and it has, and I've been improving it ever since those decades ago, and it still plays that role. But the thing that I needed to shift was to shift away from representing the method or the process, and instead represent the people and represent different people's approaches to the same thing, or represent related things that we hadn't been thinking of when we were thinking of solutions. And so that's really what I've done with my career, is just started exploring all of that, understanding different people have different approaches, learning how to hear at depth and form rapport with people so that they feel like they can tell me at depth what their approach is, and then be able to support that. That's the whole thing. I would never make it at Facebook or Twitter or Google or anybody who like counts engagement as their biggest metric. Because we need metrics on how we support people getting their thing done their way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so exciting to hear, like hearing the beginning and sort of the inception, and this is like pre-UX today, and what I think many people know and consider UX to be. You had such a major part in shaping that. And I think kind of like a follow-up question before we delve into some of the sort of secrets of your success. This is the one that I feel a little bit excited about, but I thought it'd be fun to start with perhaps a project or an accomplishment that you're personally very proud of. You're so accomplished and a pioneer in product strategy. If there's a particular thing that you feel excited about.
I know. I think one of the things that I'm particularly excited about now is that I get to meet a lot of people and work with a lot of people from around the world, especially through the courses that I teach. And what I did was I specifically thought, hey, the US dollar doesn't have the same exchange rate around the globe. And there are a lot of people who can't afford it. Like even a $90 ticket is like wildly expensive for them. So oddly enough, one of my most proud moments is that I made it accessible for everybody. So you pick your ticket price. Even if you're in the US, you get a couple of ticket prices to pick from so that it is possible. The answer is always yes, we will make it happen. And straight, like there was this gal, so this is something I'm working on right now. Most of my courses are live, but she is a PhD up in Vancouver. And she says, hey, I desperately want to take your courses, all 6 of them, but I'm like flat broke. I'm a grad student. And I'm like, the answer is yes. We can figure out, maybe you can do something for me in exchange, right? And so what we're working on, it turns out her PhD is on self-directed online learning. That is, the metrics are not by homework or tests or anything, but by sense of confidence. And every time I have a meeting with her, which is at least once a week, she blows my mind. And so we're going to roll out something that is more self-directed and branched, which hews super closely to what I'm talking about with respect to the idea of creating different solutions for different thinking styles, so that no matter, there's not one standard operating procedure, right? No matter what your thinking style is, you will recognize a path forward. And according to her, we will be able to give some people a sense of confidence. So that's super exciting. It has not rolled out yet. It probably will take another year, but
all in due time.
Right.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted to get back. Diana had asked a question about metrics. I think that you touched on this a little bit, but one of the questions, which I think is something that almost keeps me up at night a little bit, is how do you measure the impact that you're having on a team?
That's a hard one, because each team has a different context, and even each team member has a different context, a different set of relationships. So I have to admit that I would say over half of the work and studies that I've done with teams has failed, hasn't gone anywhere. It's been fantastic research. You can see ways forward, but the trust that team has with each other, or that team has with their own stakeholders, doesn't exist. In a lot of cases, people leave the position and leave the valuable data on the shelf, or they get merged and it gets left behind. So I think when I was a young coder, they would say out of every 10,000 or 1,000 lines of code, 10 of them would actually go into production. So it's something like that. It's like, okay, yeah, it's not always going to work. One of the things that I'd like to teach and help people learn, also, I need to learn this. I was going to start a course on it, but I don't know enough about it. I need to do some research about it, is how do you develop better relationships with stakeholders, with collaborators, so that you can all aim in the same direction. I teach a course on empathy among team members, which is basically helping people recognize what they're saying to one another, what it's made up of, and focus a little bit more on depth. focus a little bit more on guiding principles, because normally when you get down to the guiding principles, you can see each other's point of view and respect each other's point of view. So the example that I do in that course is like a product manager and a user experience researcher. The product manager wants X to happen. The researcher wants to research it to make sure we're going in the right direction. The product manager goes home over the weekend, draws up what they want done, and hands it back and says, just implement this. And when you get down to the guiding principles, the product manager doesn't want to lose momentum. And by momentum, they mean progress, right? Mm-hmm. But they want success. They don't want it to fail. The researcher wants to make sure that we're making some decisions that actually support people, as opposed to just that product manager who's only going to design for himself. And the product manager is thinking, well, that's going to take too long. But you're right. We don't want to design just for me. Most of them understand that. Most of them, want the right thing, but don't understand the way to do it. And the idea that the time it takes is different than the time it takes to loop around in a development cycle. So once you get people talking about what their guiding principles are and what the success is that they want to see, it's the same. And that's the point at which we can get better conversations going. But I think that that's a place going forward that needs a lot of work. A lot of us don't want to take the time to build those relationships, or I suspect from what I hear from people, we are either transitioning in from a different career and we don't feel like it's our place yet to sort of push back, or we're more junior and it doesn't feel like we know how to push back. Yet both those situations, you're having inner thinking, and your inner thinking is valid. Your inner thinking is not something that needs to be hidden, but to be shared and discussed. So this idea of taking time to develop relationships, taking time to allow respect for and time for each other's inner thinking, is valuable. It's like super powerful. If you keep it to yourself, it's detrimental, I think, to the team. But there's also this idea of hierarchy, and I was like, I'm not a manager, so right. And that's different from team to team. But being, I don't know. I think that this is going to be something that changes. Businesses, the way the businesses are run, I think is going to be a little bit less hierarchical and a little bit more collaborative as our new generations come in. I truly believe this.
I agree. And I love your emphasis on relationship building. And I think that's something that's not often talked about a lot when it can get a bit bureaucratic trying to make a case for qualitative research.
Yeah.
On that note, you talked a bit about guiding principles, and I was wondering if you could sort of define that a little bit more. It seems that, at the core of what you're saying. And so if you could explain your thought process around that a little bit more and what that means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So a guiding principle is unique to a person. It's also unique to that person's purpose and their context. It's also a trait of their thinking style. So a guiding principle is not like an overarching thing that everybody agrees on. And it seems like in academics and in business, everybody wants like that simple equation that explains everything, hence something like Myers-Briggs. So it's like, I want a horoscope and now I can identify you, and then go back to the way I normally do things. And instead, let's talk about relationship building. For example, what's interesting is that if you go and have a listening session with, say, your boss or your boss's boss or your coworker or that person sort of at your level in that other department that you like to have lunch together or something. In those listening sessions, and I call them listening sessions, that's only if they're formal. So let's just say in those lunch hours, you want to listen for very concretely what somebody's been thinking about, what's been going through their mind and their heart with respect to a particular purpose they've been trying to achieve. So with respect to your boss or your coworker or whatever, you've got some purposes that you all share. So what has been on people's minds about it? What has actually, like last Tuesday, went through your mind when you read that email about such and such? Really concrete, pin to a place and time helps, because it helps a person say what they were thinking. And in what they were thinking, it's going to be like this. The thought touches off an emotion, or the email touches off an emotion and then touches off a thought that touches off another emotion that touches off a decision. And the decision is often built on a guiding principle. And a guiding principle is basically just an instruction set that you use to make decisions, but it's really contextual. So if it's about a project, it probably comes from projects you've done in the past, relationships you've had with past bosses, right? The way that boss is now influencing the way that you make decisions with this current boss, even though they're totally different. And so guiding principles are not built on truth. It's just experience and what you've heard. If it's a guiding principle, say, with respect to how you eat, it's probably been influenced by your parents or your kindergarten teacher or something that you read or saw in a movie. It gets influenced in it and it can shift. Mm-hmm. So this is the interesting thing, especially like about politics, is that it can shift. People influence one another. And so the idea of understanding, like in those lunch hours, trying to understand somebody's inner thinking, trying to understand their emotional reactions, how everything sets each other up, and then what was that decision based on, and seeing where it came from in the history, that helps you understand the way that person thinks. That helps that person explain the way they think and become aware of it and possibly shift it later. Right? So,
and that's yes, it's so foundational, and I think with some of that foundational thinking, I think another thing that I really wanted to get your thoughts on, and that I was hoping you'd be able to share with the group, is problem-based research, and just a bit about what problem-based research is. I think that there's some concepts I might be more familiar with, like evaluative research, and I really love the idea of problem-based research, and I was hoping you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listening is foundational. Listening is foundational to all research, but there are some kinds of research or things that are called research in the business world that aren't really research, that are more theater, that are done because somebody else does it that way, or they were asked to do it that way. So it's really important. I have 2 diagrams out, and I'm working on a new set too. The 2 diagrams that are out there, and you can probably find them in my Twitter feed or on the website. One of them is a diagram that says, hey, look, these are all sorts of data collection techniques. And we can collect data that help us, like either with evaluative, like let's judge how well this thing is working for a person, for a thinking style, for my boss, for our organization, or maybe generative, like how can we create something new that will work better? both of those are about looking at solutions. They're about creating solutions and ideas. An idea is a solution. It isn't prior to the solution, it's a solution. And in our culture, there are probably very few cultures who don't do this. In our culture, we emphasize coming up with solutions. When we are like 2 years old, we are taught this. As we go through kindergarten, as we go through grade school, high school, college, postgrad, we are taught that it's important to demonstrate that we know an answer, or we can come up with a new answer based on the things that we've learned. Even in our jobs, we come to the table and we want to prove that we can bring something to the table. So it's everything's judged by that. We're all like sort of thinking around that. And the idea of solutions is fine, but before we come up with a solution, need to understand who is that solution for. Oftentimes that who is based on this research theater. It's based on sort of this, let's do a survey, and, we'll make up the survey answers, and people have to sort of pick the answer that might be sort of closest to what they think. I know there's good ways to do surveys. I use surveys myself, but only for recruiting, not for anything else, because to me, it does not bring us true understanding. It doesn't get that depth. It doesn't get the inner thinking, the emotional reactions, and the guiding principles. There's no way to think of that in advance. And also it's personal. It's personal to a person's purpose and a context. So you're not going to gather data that way. With respect to understanding people deeply in terms of what they're trying to get done, which is a larger purpose, we can do problem space research. So this is taking the idea of like, okay, if you work at, say, Dropbox, right? You've got a bunch of solutions. You think people are trying to store things, which is your solution, right? Why would you store things? Well, let's see. Using our solution, you would store them because you need to get them between people, or whatever else you've already thought of. Now, that means there are purposes related to the solution itself, but there might be purposes that are larger than the solution, that your solution could also support, but you're missing those things. So one of the really cool research studies that I did recently was for I can't talk about the client, but it was for a company who wanted to help people gain self-confidence. And to do that, what we did was we wanted to understand what self-confidence looks like, not in the solution space, not looking at it through the lens of what this client already produces or thinks they can produce, but through the point of view of the person. So we chose as our frame the purpose of, get this, personal identity change. Personal identity change requires self-confidence. We could have picked another purpose, right, that would require self-confidence, but we decided on that one. And that's a part of problem space research and solution space research, is that you're never done. You will always be sketching your way forward and exploring and learning. But in problem space research, often you can put it all into the same data representation. Because it is evergreen, it does not go stale, whereas in the solution space, it often goes stale because the solution has changed, right? Not all the time. So anyway, with this personal identity change, we heard about not only how they created the change, but how they came up against barriers and motivated themselves through barriers. But not only that, how they decided. They told us without us asking, how they decided to do personal identity change. What was the driver? And that driver was connected to the motivation when you face those barriers. Not only that, they told us about the celebration at the end. It was really cool. We're like, we had no idea to ask about those things. It was truly just understanding what is it that what goes through your mind as you were going through this particular personal identity change. Take us through those months that you were undergoing this, or years sometimes for some people. And it was really, really amazing. We not only got all those pieces out of it, but also we came up with different people's approaches, thinking styles. So there was a group of people who okay, that identity is the identity I want. Other people have it. Other people have made the change. I don't feel qualified to do it, but somehow I desperately want it, and somehow I'm going to make myself get over there. Versus somebody who's like, I envision an identity that no one else has done. So I have to forge my own way, versus somebody who's like, I don't know what identity I want. I just don't like this one. And so I'm going to go sort of explore and expose myself to a lot of different identities to see what really resonates with me. And then I can make that change, which is really interesting. Strangely enough, the people who were in that last one, none of the way that they presented themselves was very aggressive. So it was really hard when we were doing the analysis and the synthesis to see past that and understand what they were trying to get at. Yeah.
And then I think sort of piggybacking off of that a bit, I think this is related, but it's a question that came into the chat. Is how do you know when you've done enough research? So for instance, yes, I think that you probably have an answer for this, but it crossed my mind when you were saying, hey, it was really difficult to sort of pull the analysis for this particular group. And so when do you know that you've done enough and that you feel good forging a path forward?
Patterns. And the patterns are related to the framing. So with real research, the validity is in the patterns that you get. If you're not getting patterns back from your data, you need to reframe it. Okay. It's not that it's bad data. It's just that it's data from too many different frames, and there's nothing in common. Okay. So, you will, this happened to me when I was doing some research for a company called Healthwise. And the very first study that we did together, and they have since done 14 studies, because there's all sorts of different health things that they want to support people with. But the first one was how do you cope with the health of a loved one? And it was way too broad. It's as if, to give you a simpler example, if we were to talk about people who go into a really large store that sells a lot of different things, for example, Home Depot here in the US, you would get too many answers. You might get an electrician going in there or a plumber going in there, but you might get somebody whose refrigerator just died and they have to replace the refrigerator, or somebody who's thinking about getting a new carpet for the dining room, or somebody who's on their way to Aunt Flo's birthday party and forgot a present and knows that Aunt Flo likes begonias, right? So there's no commonality there. So you have to frame it in a way that you will get patterns back. And that frame is the purpose. And the purpose, there's so many different purposes. There's purposes at a broad level, at a medium level, at a very narrow level. You can explore a lot of them at different levels. And the choice you make is driven by the knowledge you need right now in your org and where that org is trying to go immediately. So there's no one answer. You can do research around different, like, say a different research study every quarter for the next 30 years. And then you'll hand it off to your kids who are taking over for your job when you retire, and they can go do it for another 30 years. It's not like it's got an end. It's really bounded by the purpose and where your org wants to go. But the future that I envision, which I hope will happen within the next 30 years, is that I'd like this to happen within the next 10 years, is that we will start creating different solutions for different thinking styles, given a purpose. So rather than one solution that sort of expands and contracts to fit everybody, let's say Medium as a writing tool, it's meant for a specific purpose and it's not meant for other purposes. And they're fairly clear about it, but go take Microsoft Word and you know how many tool sets you can add to that menu toolbar at the top? They're like, oh, let's make this, expand and contract for all these different, maybe you're going to be a PhD student in math and you're going to be writing something with a lot of formulas. So here's that toolbar for that. And, it's like, let's instead try to focus on and pay attention to what a person's approach is to the purpose and throw a different path in front of them based on their thinking style. And I think this might be a good use. I don't think any of the other uses that I've heard of so far for machine learning are worthwhile. But if we've done true research and we understand a few thinking styles, we still need to understand more thinking styles, but there's a few out there. And the machine can, like the algorithm can sort of learn from your behavior whether you match one of these thinking styles. It will then tell you, hey, we think you match this thinking style. We'd like to give you this experience that matches your approach. And wow, that so the digital office at the UK, the government office, they're doing a lot of this kind of research. And for example, when you're out of a job, do you apply for compensation, right? Or not? And when you do, what is your thinking style? There are a lot of thinking styles out there. Right now, there's one way to apply. They are trying to create different ways to apply so that you feel heard. Right?
Absolutely. Yes, and I think that this dovetails pretty well into one of the things that I think we wanted to touch on a bit, was this idea of sort of inclusivity and reducing bias. And there's a lot of questions in the Q&A coming in about bias as well. Yeah. And I think among many areas of your expertise, you also have deep expertise in inclusive product strategy. And at Ladies at UX and in the UX field more broadly, I think this idea of like ethical and inclusive and accessible design is absolutely top of mind for many.
Yeah.
It sounds like a large part of it is helping others understand their role in bias as well. And so I'm curious, what are some of the tools or the frameworks that you've either developed or employed to reduce bias, or perhaps like get people on board to understand their own roles in that?
Yeah, most of the way that I'm not talking about it as much in an like interpersonal way, so much besides let's do some looking at guiding principles, but I talk about it with respect to the word demographics. So often in our news and our media, in our TV, movies, entertainment, everything, we use demographics as a shorthand for behavior, for thinking, for typical, like, oh yeah, it correlates to that. And the correlation in people's mind becomes causation. Okay, we've all had the professor tell us correlation is not causation. But that is not something that everybody can like sort of bring to their real lived world. And so what I am helping everybody, because one of the things is that I'm not the person who's going to land this perfectly. Everyone who has lived these experiences are going to help land this. Everyone in the next generation is going to help land this. I'm not alone for certain. And I am learning every day. So as long as we all keep learning, one of the things that I'm trying to help us be aware of is when we let a demographic come out of our mouth. Mm-hmm. Just to notice that at first, just to let yourself stop doing it, because the demographic is not the causation. The guiding principle is, the inner thinking is, right? And those don't go along demographic lines unless the thing you're talking about is discrimination, or the thing you're talking about is something physiological. Okay, so you could say, oh, you're a woman, so or you're a man, so you don't have a period, right? But if you are a person identifying as a man who's physiologically changed from different birth, what does that mean, right? You can't say that. So you have reactions, you have inner thinking, you have guiding principles that you bring up either as a shield or a way of coping when you hear that sort of thing, physiologically or discrimination wise, right? So that's when it causes inner thinking, emotions, and guiding principles. But generally, like when you're trying to buy groceries, that's not going to cause it. Your other guiding principles around buying groceries, right?
Yeah.
And those don't run along demographics lines necessarily. So one of the things that I try to do is just notice when we're just saying a demographic, try to suck that away and talk about the inner thinking or the guiding principle or the thinking style or something instead. Or try to imagine, oh, wait, this is about discrimination. This does make sense to talk about a demographic.
Yeah. And on that, there's so many great questions coming into the Q&A. So thank you everyone for contributing. I'm trying and I'm hoping to get to them. I had a quick follow-up on that and sort of demographics. I think that we're so conditioned to use that to describe a user base. And so I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about archetypes and personas for a moment.
Uh-huh.
And I was hoping that you could talk a bit about your stance on these and using these as artifacts, and in particular, some of the ways that they may introduce bias.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so there's the question. There are, so the way that I teach it is that there's problems with personas, and the problems basically come from the fact that it has a dual heritage. It has a very strong and long history with marketing. And then it has a shorter history, but more depth with user experience, with Kim Goodwin and Alan Cooper's work around personas. So the way that they get created is either based on depth, which would be fine, or based on somebody pulling it out of thin air or pulling it out of like these numbers that are demographics that they're making guesses about, which is not valid. That is the way that marketing has done it in the past. And I believe it's probably because they were trying to figure out how to get ads in front of people and where those people were likely to be. I mean, there's valid roots to it, but it's not a valid way to create personas. Either way, when personas get created, they often get created with demographics. And what I just said about demographics, you put a demographic in a persona and it ruins it. So recently, Kim Goodwin and Jared Spool have been writing, hey, it's not about the persona, it's about the scenario. It's about the person in a context. And I think what gets lost when you start talking about scenarios is I've never seen a scenario where they identify who the thinking style is or who the persona is. or who the archetype is. A thinking style is an archetype. I'm just using a different word than persona because of all that baggage.
Yeah.
With a persona, you could call them personas. Use whatever word works for you in your context. I'm not insisting on vocabulary, but just don't use demographics. And when you place that thinking style or that archetype into a context and write a scenario, talk about that thinking style, what guiding principles and inner thinking they're bringing to it. Talk about that context. What sub part of the purpose are they trying to get done? In what respect to the part of the world and day and whatever they're in, right? And it's going to be very specific to that. You would use that same purpose and context for different thinking styles. So you'd have like 3 or 4 scenarios that represent the different thinking styles. I don't see people doing that yet. But there was this beautiful article that Jared Spool wrote about 2 different characters. And at that point, as a character, you can name them, you can give them demographics, right? Because they're a character, like in a movie or a TV show. However, they have to behave according to the thinking style. But the beautiful thing was that he did not give demographics to the character, just like vague demographics. Not the typical like, oh, it's a woman who's doing, blah blah blah, that kind of thing, and the age and stuff, and like she loves these certain handbags, but the scenario is about going to the airport. I don't know, right? Anyway, the beautiful thing was that at the end of his 2 examples of scenarios, he says, hey, this could be and is exactly the same thinking style. What I want to make sure that we're doing is writing different scenarios for different thinking styles, because in some cases, it predicates or requires different experiences, different support that we give to people, different tone of voice even. It could be a completely different experience. It could be just a change in vocabulary. But definitely what we are aiming to do is make a person feel heard, make a person feel respected, by recognizing and matching and supporting their way of thinking as they approach this, not forcing them into a generic way of thinking. Think about YouTube or Netflix. Both of those, again, engagement companies. You'd never find me working there, but you go in there and it is built for a certain thing, right? And if you have a different way of approaching it, you tear your hair out. If there's any time that you've used anything where you're tearing your hair out, it's because it doesn't match your thinking style.
I would love to. I like the questions keep coming in. I think people are really hoping to get your thoughts on this. And one of the ones that came from Jennifer here that I wanted to touch on before moving into the rest of the Q&A questions is she said, how do you reconcile utilizing your humanity and instincts with our society's need to be both objective and scientific? How do you use that humanity to understand users?
Yeah. So going back to that foundation, remember you used that word, listening, and that foundation of going to depth. Typically when we listen, when we have conversation with each other day to day, we stay at surface, we stay at explanations, we stay at like sort of statements of fact and scene setting and my preferences or my opinions about something, or even my conjecture about something I would do in the future. That's all surface. That doesn't tell you what went through my mind. It doesn't tell you what my emotional reaction was or what built up a guiding principle in the past or how I use that guiding principle in the present. And so the humanity, the true understanding of other people, it's lost if we're not going to depth. So I was just talking to one of my teammates today, and his sister is all caught up in what's happening in the US right now, and texting him. And so we talked a little bit about that. And part of it was that, there were a bunch of people who went into the congressional building and they were wearing costumes and they were carrying white supremacist flags and they were carrying knives and guns and things. And so our reaction is, hey, they came there to do harm, to physically harm our Congress members and senators. But do we know that? Was it just, what was their intention? Who is asking them that? We're hoping that the FBI is asking them that. So we assume that's what they were doing. But maybe it was something else. How do we find this out? So, that's an extreme version of it. When it's less extreme, it's like your coworker saying something, right? And you leave that Zoom call and you're like, grumble, grumble. They don't know what they're talking about. And then you're like, oh, right? I was just talking to somebody yesterday and they were like, there is contention and disappointment. And I'm like, what is the disappointment? Good question. I just know there's disappointment. Let's find out what the disappointment is. If we can find out what the disappointment is among the team members at depth, then we can start to resolve it. So that, I think, I don't know if that answers the question about humanity so much, but that, I believe, is what connects us. It's what allows us to truly feel I hate that word, feel each other, but it's like understand each other, right?
Yeah. Tip tissue.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this one's it's an interesting one. It's a COVID one, and I think everybody can feel the pangs of this one a bit. But do you have any tips on on building meaningful relationships while working remotely? It's hard to be in person, especially when you're new on a team.
So the question there is, what does that mean in person versus remote? Actually, when you're trying to find out about a person's inner thinking, understand what makes them tick, I don't think it counts. In fact, all of my research is done remotely without video, because I believe that the remoteness of it and the disconnection from seeing each other, even though I love seeing each other on Zoom, when I'm doing a study, what I want to do is connect with somebody's mind about their purpose. I only do this in person if it's a very habitual thing that they may not be able to really say everything that went through their mind because it's so low level, like cooking. If you cook a lot, so I'll go into the kitchen while they're cooking dinner and we'll have a listening session. We'll have a listening session by phone first so that I can sort of establish rapport, get some of their guiding principles, understand some of their inner thinking. And then I go into the kitchen as they're cooking dinner and I'm asking them again, so what went through your mind just there? Yeah. Right? Hey, how come you're cutting that turmeric in the air above the pan? Where'd that come from? What's your thinking, right? So it's that sort of thing. And so when you go back to the same thing with relationship development, I think the question is really, you're new on the team. Okay? You're new on the team. No matter how you're interacting, how do you establish relationships? You have to work at it. When you're in person, what do? Does relationship building get done in the conference room? Does it get done when you're sitting, both of you, at your laptops? Or does it get done when you're having a break together or running to get coffee together or having lunch together? How does it get done? It gets done when you hear another person's experiences and they're thinking about that experience. It gets done when you are able to talk to another person about their thoughts about a decision that just got made and how to implement it or how to fight against it. It gets done when you're talking to one another and hearing what their inner thinking is, what their guiding principles are, what their emotional reactions are. And that can happen anywhere. You just have to make the time to make it happen. So the in-person thing, maybe it's easier to make the time. And I think this is why we fall flat on developing relationships. Because when we're in person, we sort of let it happen. We might have lunch with somebody and we don't learn a darn thing about them. But the next time we have lunch with them, maybe a little thing comes up, right? And we're afraid to ask about it. We're not intentional about it when we're in person. When we're apart, we have to be intentional about it. When then we get back in person, we can be intentional about it. And I think it needs to be intentional even when we're in person. It is not something to let happen. It definitely takes time, but you have to make it happen. You have to be, for a part of your lunchtime, sort of caught up in that listener mindset, caught up in wearing that listener hat where you've got this beginner's mind and you're like, I just heard you say something that's super interesting and I want to hear more about it, but not just hear more about like your explanation of it, but to listen for when I can sense you've got some thinking there and ask what that thinking is, or listen for when you've sort of alluded to an emotion. And we don't really like come out with our emotions necessarily unless we're in a totally safe space. But you're alluding to that. And that's like a little indication. Like if you're looking at a creek and there's a rock underneath it, it makes that ripple. You're like, there's that ripple. I'm going to ask what's under there. And maybe ask more about why it happened. And we might actually get back to a guiding principle. Intention. It has to be intentional, those relationships. When you're new on a team, this is your job. When you're new in a new role, same team, it's still your job. When you're a manager, it's definitely your job because part of your purpose is to help each of the team members develop themselves in their career. So a gal named Pei Ling Chin, she's in Malaysia. She mentors people as a manager, and she has written a really good article. I tweeted about it. And that was just about that, listening to her mentees over and over again, finding those things at depth, mapping those things over time at depth so she can see how well she's doing in supporting people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I'm like, oh my gosh, I think we have about another 5 or 10 minutes left, and we have a good chunk of questions, and I just wish I could.
One thing that I'll say right now is that I have a Slack workspace that anybody can join. Just go into my website and ask in the email contact me thing, and we can add you to that, and we can there's more discussion going on in there. Yeah, so it's not just this chance.
That's great. And for anybody that's still listening, and if we aren't able to get to your question, I'll go ahead and write these down, and then in a follow-up email to attendees, we'll link to the Slack chat where you're able to pose that question in there as well. I think that's phenomenal. Yeah. I think we have time for probably about one more. And I think that I will hop on this one that had just come in. Well, this is a pretty great one from Tiffany, and something that's also top of mind as well for me. But I think she said, regarding the breadth of inclusion, and speaking of what's happening in the US, when we embrace inclusion, how do we hold space for including people who are also from historically vulnerable and underrepresented communities with people who are presently excluded? She said, for example, in the tech world, then in society at large, I'm thinking of the range of, let's say, Trump supporters or conservative Christians as an example.
Right. Yeah. So how do I answer this? I think so. There's a woman named Suzanne Goldstein who's working on those last two things. And she's a listener. She knows how to do this. I have also heard from people who say, believers, conspiracy theorists who believe in conspiracy theories, believers even in religion. People are believing things that they can't touch, right? They can't prove necessarily, but that sound right. We ourselves are believers in things that sound right. Inclusivity sounds right to us. Okay. Could anybody reach out to us and try to persuade us that it isn't important? No. Right? No one's going to persuade us that inclusivity is not important. Likewise, we can't persuade a Trump supporter that what they believe, like carrying guns around, isn't the right thing to do. That isn't, I'm not necessarily the one to answer that, but those are the things that I've learned from other people, is that we don't go around trying to persuade, and we don't listen to then tell the person using their own words to change. Somebody, forgotten her name, but she wrote a book about conspiracy theories and how she says the only people who can change somebody's mind is somebody who also believed that. Right? So it's not about changing minds, it's about understanding and not agreeing, but respecting that it means something to that person. It is not easy, especially when it's interpersonal. I know for myself, I have family who are Trump supporters, and it is not possible for me to talk to them about that. So it's just an area that we don't touch. We touch on the areas that we can connect on. However, there are people in the courses and in my Slack channel who have reached out and have been able to connect. It's interesting. It's, I think, different for everybody. When I teach people how to listen, I ask them to go and listen with people, but I say, don't try it with your family, because you all have history and baggage together. And so you probably end up in the same place. But there are people in my courses who do that and have success.
Yeah.
So it's not, I am just one thinking style in this, and everybody brings their own thing. How do I answer that question? I look at what other people are doing. It's not, there's no one answer. There's no one context. There's no one purpose. There's just what I've understood, that it's not about persuasion. Mm-hmm. And this is what applies then, like within our own workplaces. It's not about persuading that stakeholder or that PM that they're wrong, that they should do it this different way. It's about understanding where they're coming from. And the hope is they will understand where you're coming from. And then those guiding principles, those goals, those operating rules that you're both using are going to become known to each other, and you will be able to collaborate better. I don't know if that works for democracy. Fingers crossed.
Fingers are absolutely crossed on my end. Indi, thank you so much for just at time. This has been just so phenomenal, and you've been so generous with your time. And thank you for talking to us and to our community. And I'm just, on behalf of everyone here, so grateful. And thank you.
super, super happy. I mean, truly the most beautiful things in my career is meeting everybody and knowing that we're all working on things together and we're learning from each other, and none of us know everything, but we can share it. So that's super cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I will work with Prabha and Mai here to get some of these questions written down and send them over to you as well with a Slack link to everybody else on the website so that they may have direct access to you as well.
Yeah, well, one of the things about Slack is that I'm not going to answer all the questions. Everybody can answer all the questions, which is really cool. There are a lot of people who have gone through a lot of different experiences and have great ways. Like I say, let's do it this way, and they're all like, well, that's not going to work here. A guy named Tiago down in Australia, who works at a company called Seek, has written a bunch of articles on Medium about how he managed to land this at his org, which is super cool. I've done some research myself with people who have landed this and created a mental model diagram about how people use mental model diagrams, which of course is what we would do. So it's all underway. We're all trying to figure this out. So I will answer what I can. Yeah. So yes, I hope that I see people on the Slack workspace. I also do posts on social media in LinkedIn and Twitter. These are mostly managed by my assistant, Nathan, but I'll take a look at them at least a couple times a week and respond where I can, which is really fun. One of the really cool things is we rolled out a new version of my website that has a lot of recordings that I've done over the years. So you can go to the knowledge section of that and go through like a lot of essays, but also a lot of talks I've given, and also a lot of podcasts where we just sort of this kind of thing. We range through a lot of interesting questions. And some of the more recent ones, especially some of the talks that I gave in December, are really interesting. So have at it.
Yes, I will absolutely +1 and plug that. I've watched a few of them, and they are so informative
Cool.
and touch on a lot of what we discussed today in greater detail. So I would absolutely recommend that to folks.
Yeah. And in terms of your own work, I highly encourage all of you to talk about this internally, talk about this at conferences, do your own podcast guest appearances, write about it, and reference me, reference each other. You can use all of my imagery because I think I've got my name at the bottom of it, but it doesn't, build on it. Build on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Indi.
Yeah.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Have a good evening. All right, take care, and may we all be in contact and hopefully have a good 2021.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. Thank you all.
Right. Okay. Bye.